Navigating the Shroud of Turin research can be a really daunting task, but with me today is just the man for the job. I'll be right back. Gracious gang, it's Mike Creavey, host of the Gracious Guest Show, here with you for another episode, and we are going to take a look at the Shroud of Turin, as we love to do here pretty regularly. Before we do that, please make sure that you like this video, subscribe to this channel, share it far and wide with someone that you think will be benefited somehow by this today, especially when it comes to their encounter with our Lord, the proposition of his resurrection, and what that really means for us, really seen through these questions that are generated by considering the Shroud of Turin and all the mysteries surrounding it. So my guest today to explore all of this is Mr. Jim Bertrand. He's coming to us from Nebraska. Jim spent 39 years teaching high school science. He has been interested in shroud research for many, many decades now, and has given well over 300 talks at this point in 24 states, 40 different dioceses. He even appeared on EWTN Live with Father Mitch Pacwa in 2022. I've got that linked below if you want to check that out. And Jim is really well versed in all of this and has been for a very long time. So I'm really thrilled to be able to dive into this discussion about the Shroud of Turin with Mr. Jim Bertrand. Check it out. This title of the idea of shroud research explained, and as you had indicated in our emails, that this is a real mission of yours. And maybe, just for those who aren't familiar with you, do you want to just share a little bit briefly about sort of what brought you to the shroud and why this particular kind of mission is so important to you to really help kind of explain this research that's often confusing to people?
Well, I'd be glad to. Back in 1995, I invited the world's foremost expert on the shroud, Dr. John Jackson, to give a presentation at my parish, St. Peter. And we got to be friends, stayed in touch over the next 25 years. And he had finished over 4 decades of research and put it into a book called The Critical Summary. And at the International Shroud Conference in St. Louis in 2014, I was asked if I could take that information and put it into a PowerPoint so that people could absorb that. So I
Sure.
said yes to that and spent many hundreds of hours developing the PowerPoint, updating it, fitting it for different audiences. And since that time, I've given 30 or 40 talks a year around the country, like 24 states now. And the doors have always been open. I guess the mission part of it is that I don't have a website and I don't have a budget. I simply give the talk, and then by word of mouth, I'll hear from somebody else to go this way or that way.
Sure.
And so God's opening doors that way. And I see myself perhaps as a link between the scientific information and the public. How can
Right.
they've got it up here. How can you get it in a way that you really understand it? And so
Sure.
that's been my mission, I guess I could say, Mike.
Well, and you had shared in the biography that I shared earlier, and folks who are watching this have already seen that portion, that your own background in teaching and in really the scientific sort of interests, has that been, from a scientific perspective, would you say that that's maybe your primary interest, or is it more historical, or is it kind of all of it?
Well, I love history as well. Matter of fact, I love World War I, World War II history.
Hmm.
But I think the science aspect of it is I've been given a lot of opportunity to share scientific information with the thousands of students I've had. And so you have to
Right.
plan, what's your vocabulary going to be? What's the sequence going to be? How are you going to do this in such a way so that people can understand? So I had about 40 years prep work on that, and that helped. And then besides that, learning the scientific aspects about the shroud, it just became, from very, very likely and probable to, so coherent and compelling
Hmm.
that it just seems very reasonable. And so what I do is I just share the facts and let the facts speak for themselves. And
Sure.
people can come to their own well-reasoned judgments.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I to the level that I share with my students, I know it's always interesting. They're I think a lot of them, what interests them, and certainly what interests me, is just how many things, like as I often put it to them, this may or may not be proof. I said, but look at it from the standpoint of, if this thing were authentic, is this something that would be reasonable for you to expect it to portray or demonstrate, or would you expect to see this particular, these details basically, and so I think they appreciate that, as part of my approach, which tends to be more of a broader kind of meditation on the passion, the passion
Mhm.
of Jesus. So, so I don't know. Would you like to? Do you want me to pull the slides up here? How do you want to start here?
Well, I'll have a couple lines here about World
Sure.
War One, and then we'll pull that
Yes.
first slide up here. Yeah, these are some things about the shroud that perhaps people haven't heard of, or if they have heard of, I'll try to give you a little more detail on. But I think when you're delve into history, many times if you just go to a search and you're going to read something that somebody else read about in 2020 or 24 from 100 years before. And so what I tried to do is get the inside story on what happened to the shroud during World War II. And I think the further back you go in time to that date, the closer
Hmm.
you get to the real information. So this was an Italian article that had been written in 1946, right after the Shroud returned to Turin. So the slides that people are going to see and hear about this, that was my source of information from this. It was originally
I
in
see.
Italian, and I got an English translation for it with it. So, well, let's just go
Sure.
ahead and begin with the first one there. This was where the Shroud was housed during the war years between 1939 and 1938, 39 and 1946. And
Mm.
it's well known that, Hitler, as he went through his countries, was snatching up all kinds of artwork and relics and things, had a great interest in
Right.
that. But of equal concern was that the shroud might be destroyed by bombing. So what were they going to do with it? And so great secrecy was taken in removing it from Turin to a remote Benedictine abbey, Montevergine, which is
Mm.
about 12 miles outside Avellino. And so Hitler invaded September 1st, 1939 in Poland. And on September 7th, the shroud was taken out of Turin, and it followed a very interesting trail. There were only a handful of people that knew about this, 3 or 4 people at the end of Turin.
Mm.
Pius XII is one of them. Of course, the owner of the shroud was King Emmanuel III, who was one of the last of the Savoys, the King of Italy at that
Right.
time. He owned the shroud and his family had it since the 15th century. And the Secretary of State knew about it, as did Giovanni Montini, who was the Assistant Secretary
Mm.
and later became Pope Paul VI.
Yeah. Sure.
Now, initially, there were 3 different locations considered of where are we going to hide the shroud. One of them was in a royal palace in Rome called the Quirinal, which is now a hotel. The other one was the Vatican, and the third one would have been the Abbey at Monte Cassino. And none of those
Mm.
seemed to be safe locations, as historical evidence showed. So the choice fell
Right.
on this monastery in Montevergine, where it was kept hidden till the end of the war in a little secondary chapel. And
Sure.
so the shroud was taken by train from Turin, which is northern Italy, down to Rome. It spent some days there in the Royal Palace, and then later in September, it was taken by vehicle and driven eastward uh, to Montevergine, which is about 12 miles from Avellino, Italy.
Mm.
And even there, being at Montevergine, it was at some risk because the Germans had the area, but it was bombed heavily by the Allies on September 14th, 1943.
Mm.
And given its altitude, it was an observatory point for German troops
Sure.
and Americans afterwards. But after this bombing in Avellino, the sanctuary was opened up to approximately 1,500 refugees that were being fed and treated by those Benedictine fathers. Now, on the day that the abbey was searched, the Germans actually arrived in Montevergine, September 1943, just before sunset. And Avellino had been bombed earlier that day. And they searched the rooms of the abbey, didn't find it. All right. Later that day, they came back at 11 p.m. and they searched the area again. And this time, the abbot, and only 3 people in the monastery knew, the abbot, uh, the porter at the door, and then one other monk knew. In case some of them got killed, they would know, hey, who's going to find the shroud? 3 people
Hmm.
knew where it was at. And they were praying at this side chapel, and the shroud was underneath that chapel. And the commandant saw them praying there and said, "Oh, don't bother them. They finished their search and they
Wow.
left." So it had a close call. And October
Sure.
1943, the Americans came in. And at that point, it was no longer as much a threat, but it was really a very wise thing because even if it hadn't been destroyed by the bombs, it would not have been respected by the German invaders if
Right.
they had been in Turin asking for news about it. Matter of fact, in that same month that the shroud was being searched for in Montevergine, the German commander in Turin was looking for it. September 8th, he was asking for it and couldn't find it. And
Well, they didn't have like a decoy or anything, basically in Turin, or
now, to my
they
knowledge, they
just
didn't put a decoy
interesting.
up there. It was just taken. It was behind a grill, and
Yeah,
it was just taken that way. You can go to the second picture now.
yeah,
Oh,
sure,
you
yeah.
got the second picture. Great. This is the one in English. So the first picture was to show people. There's the after the
Oh,
war.
I think I just had the I
Right.
just put the English one up, right? Yeah,
Sure. The first
with
one was
that
just
one,
to show folks that this came from an Italian article. It was in
right.
Italian, the caption. Now you see the English caption translated. Okay, well, after the war, what's going to happen to the shroud? Well, King Emmanuel III had been the king of Italy for like 4 decades. And in 1946, Italy was going to vote for a new form of government. And he passed on the kingship to his son, Umberto II, in May of 1946. And they had a vote
I
in
see.
June of 1946, and they voted for a new form of government. But technically, the shroud is still the property of the House of Savoy. And so on June 10th, 3 days before Umberto left the country, he spent his last years in Portugal. He instructed the Cardinal Fossati of Turin to have the shroud brought back from Montevergine and replaced back into Turin. And so in his will, and he passed away in 1983, he gave the shroud to the Holy See. And so whoever is going to be acting pope would then become possessor of it. And that was in 1983 when he passed away. And so
Right.
John Paul II was probably the first successor since St. Peter to have the shroud in his hands. And here you see a picture of the shroud. Before they left the abbey, the abbot arranged for the shroud to be exhibited for a few minutes. And so
Hmm.
here they are in the abbey in Montevergine, and the monks and priests that are present are looking at the shroud. It's folded up.
Wow.
You show the next slide.
And well, and just to check, so this is the first time most of the men depicted here in the photo were aware of this, correct? Because you said
Exactly.
before it
Except
was
for
very
three of them.
secretive, but now, right, fascinating.
Except for three of them. And
Yeah,
then it was put into its case there. And there's the
right.
cardinal of the Archbishop of Turin there, the Cardinal Fossati, the cardinal, I should say.
Hmm.
And he's putting it. And then the next slide will show them going down the steps where it's
Oh,
put into
wow.
a car and is driven back to Turin, Italy. So from
Wow.
39 to 46, its whereabouts were kept a good secret. And that
Wow.
preserved it from being bombed or falling into the hands of Hitler.
That's something because now I don't know if you saw a couple of years back that movie. It was very, I think it was very popular. I enjoyed it, but Monuments Men, that sort of depicted that, and it was largely based on real accounts and everything of these Americans, basically of art experts and architects and guys who weren't like your typical soldiers,
Yeah.
forming this unit to attempt to go and retrieve and save these all kinds of artifacts, right, that Hitler was after. And that was a pretty massive effort of the Nazis to either obtain those for their own purposes or potentially to try to access things they thought might have occult power. There's all these kinds of things. So I had never heard any of this with the shroud being hidden until just in the last year, and I'd love to see someone incorporate that into a movie. I think there's there's some potential there.
I agree. I enjoyed the monuments, man. And I think the shroud would make it even all the more interesting.
Yeah. Well, so now I see the slides coming up here ahead. Did you want to continue on for
Yeah, let's let's
this
let's
next
move on
chapter here?
to the next topic. People ask the question, are there any
Yeah.
miracles associated with the shroud? And what's the answer to that question? Well, it depends if you're talking about the shroud or the holy face. Okay. Uh,
Hmm.
we don't see miracles of people touching the shroud and getting miraculously healed. Perhaps it's not for those physical miracles. There have been numerous spiritual miracles, but there was
Yeah.
one miracle in particular that's kind of involved both of them, and this occurred back last century. This is a story of Josie Woolham. She was a small girl born in England in 1945. There she is.
Hmm.
And when she was 5, she developed osteomyelitis, which is an acute inflammation of the bone marrow, very debilitating, sometimes fatal, shorter lifespans. And
Hmm.
it spread throughout her body. And by the time she was 10, her left leg, if you look at that picture, there's no shoe on her left foot.
Right.
Because it happened during the growth spurt years across the growth plate, her left leg was 8 inches shorter than her right.
Oh
And
boy.
she was worn down physically and mentally. She only weighed 42 pounds. I don't remember how much I weighed when I was 10, but I'm sure it
Hmm.
was more than 42 pounds.
Sure.
Okay?
Yeah.
Now, about this time, her father brought home a magazine that featured an article by Captain Leonard Cheshire of the Royal Air Force. in which he wrote about the shroud. And someone from his office sent her mother a picture of the holy face, right? Like something
Mhm.
like this.
Yes,
And
that's
she took
right.
that holy face and she set it up on her mantle by the fireplace there, and she prayed for healing for her doctor, for her daughter.
Hmm.
And later that hour, the hospital called and said, "You will see a great change in Josie." And the mother rushed off to the hospital expecting the worst. And when she
Hmm.
got there, Josie was up and wheeling about in her wheelchair. The doctor said she was completely healed from her osteomyelitis. And he further stated,
Wow.
"This cannot be explained scientifically," end quote. And so there was a healing for that little girl from her mother praying to the holy face on the picture in their
Wow.
mantle. But the story doesn't end there. Josie, learning about the shroud now, she wanted to know more about this. And her mother sent a request to this Captain Cheshire expressing Josie's desire to have the relic of the shroud. Now, of course, you're not going to get a little relic of the shroud, but after much effort, he arranged to get permission from King Umberto to have the shroud brought out for her. And they made the trip from
Wow.
England over to Turin, Italy.
That's the next
And
one there. Is that the
you can see that there is the RAF officer pushing her in a wheelchair. There's her left leg out there, shorter than the right one.
wow.
And they took the shroud out, and she was able to hold the shroud across her lap. And she prayed
Oh.
for that her left leg would be like her right leg, and nothing happened.
Hmm.
And upon returning, she noticed a change in her outlook on life. When her mother met her on the return, she asked her what she received in turn, and Josie replied, "More than I went to ask for," end quote.
Oh.
And she later had that left leg amputated when she was 21. She got a job as a telephone operator back in those days in 60s and 70s.
Hmm.
Telephone operators were very common. She met a man named Ray Jones in 1968, and she was married. The first child died, unfortunately, before age 1 in 1970, but then she had another boy in 1973. And in an interview, she stated, "Something changed for me in Turin. Something was given to me that day, a grace to face the daily troubles of living. I'm happy and content, and that has stayed with me every day ever since," end quote. And she
Hmm.
died from a lung ailment on May 31st, 1981. And so while the shroud did not give her this miraculous, instantaneous physical healing, it gave her this spiritual grace to bear, the load that she had to bear during her lifetime. And God's ways are always better than our ways. So I thought I
Yeah.
would share that story with you because sometimes people have misquoted it and said that, this little girl got a miraculous healing from the shroud, and it was not exactly that way, but there have been
Right.
many numerous conversions from the shroud.
Well, and I think that's such a great point because I'll just blow this up for just one sec here, but that there's a scene that's TV show, but there's a scene in this very popular series, The Chosen. I don't know if you've seen any of that, but
I'm
this
actually caught up. I've done season
is that
4.
right? Okay, yeah, we're almost done with season 4, my wife and I at this time, but with the 3 little ones around, it's kind of kind of crazy. But I love that. I thought it was very touching. I think it was in season 3. I think it was when James the Lesser, they call him Little James in the show, and in
Yes.
the show he's portrayed by an actor who has a form of paralysis. He has this disability, and it was so beautiful that they used that as kind of the vehicle to explore that question that we often have of why some miracles and why not others. And there's that beautiful scene where I can't remember exactly what he says, but Jesus basically, the moment finally comes because he's never brought it up before. James hasn't. He sort of asks him like, why not me? Like every day I'm watching you heal all these people, and I'm just wondering why not me. And he says something to the effect of trust me. I'm paraphrasing, but the
Yeah.
reward you will have will be so far beyond any suffering, and we see that in scripture multiple places. So there's that. I suppose what I'm saying is there's no way around the faith aspect of it, isn't is there?
Well
That we,
said,
we
Mike.
don't we don't get the miracles, most of us, but we
I
have
think it's
no
a very
idea
good, very good
how.
analogy. Very good
Yeah.
analogy.
Yeah, is that there's no way. It's a faith. It's a proposition of faith, right? Um, God very well may know that this particular thing I struggle with, like Paul, right, with the thorn in his side, the flesh,
Mhm.
um, maybe that's the very thing that's going to keep me from going over that edge, in
Mhm.
some mysterious way, and I'll be thanking him for it later that he didn't take it away. Who
Yes.
knows?
Well,
So,
we see the
well, I don't want
backside
to.
of the tapestry, don't we?
Yes, yeah, absolutely, yep. Well, so do you want me to jump back over here because you
Yes,
have
well, just you and I for a second here. I'll go into the next
sure.
topic. And so we've
Yeah.
done the World War II thing. We've done Josie's Miracle, and we can move now to a topic that interests people, which they often refer to
Hmm.
as carbon dating. And I think a
Yeah.
more accurate description of that is radiometric analysis. Uh,
Wow.
the instrument can measure the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14 atoms. It
Hmm.
doesn't always necessarily give you the accurate year, because if contamination or other variables have affected that ratio, it'll give you a radiometric analysis. It doesn't always give the accurate age. About 80% of the time it does, and 20% of the time radiocarbon results have to be thrown out because of contamination issues and things like that.
Wow.
But
That's a higher percentage than I realized. That's pretty
yeah,
significant.
and usually they have ways of cleaning samples, and a lot of times
Hmm.
the sample, if it's been well preserved in a dry environment, it's very key. A dry environment will be a better candidate for that. Historically, linens have not been good subjects for radiometric dating. For example, they've unearthed tombs of mummies. Okay, and you'd think that body and the cloth cleverance should be about the same age. Sometimes those are centuries apart, and so that
Wow.
can't be. And so those are examples of the 20% that are thrown out. But in the case of this slide, your people
You're
are
saying,
seeing,
Jim, I'm sorry, just to clarify, the differential between the cloth wrappings themselves and the actual body itself, or carbon
right?
dating of
That
organic material from the body. Okay.
the linen might appear to be several centuries younger or older
Wow.
than the body, so they don't
Hmm.
match up. All right.
Interesting.
What our audience is looking at now is a contact for a really interesting paper. You had Emanuela Marinelli and
Yes.
Kristen Casabianca on one of your programs. She mentioned this, and in case people didn't have a time to track that down, they could take their cell phone and get a quick shot of that. But she
Sure.
had a very interesting paper about what happened with the carbon dating, what was said before, during, and after. All right, what was going on. It's an excellent 30-page paper, but it's an easy read. Probably 15 pages of it is footnotes and references, but
Hmm.
it gives a very nice overview of what was going on with that. And along with that, Joseph Marino has written recently an 800-page book.
Was that
And
the? Oh, I didn't know if you wanted me to jump to.
that's okay. That's fine.
Was that?
You know, Emanuela, in her talk with
Let's
you,
get there.
she talked about some 30 disciplines are involved. There's
Yeah.
many more than that. And if you go to the next slide,
Sure.
Joseph Marino has written a paper, and it actually has 102 different sciences that have been published regarding
Wow.
aspects of the shroud. And this is just the first few, but there are 102 of them. So it really is very multidisciplinary in terms of
Yeah.
what's gone into this. Over 1,400 scientists have published on the shroud in the last century, and by an overwhelming 8-to-1 margin, they publish information that is coherent with authenticity, even if
Yeah.
they're atheists. There are
Sure.
many atheists that believe that the shroud, that this is Jesus. They may not believe that Jesus is God, but they believe that this shroud that we have could only have wrapped him for many, many reasons.
Wow. Well, and I just think it's fascinating to me because as someone who has always been interested in the sciences, but that's not ever been my particular area of expertise or my bailiwick, per se. I mean, I couldn't name 102 scientific
I saw
disciplines,
some new ones I hadn't seen before.
like what is that? I could probably name 10 or 15 maybe, but yeah, that's fascinating. Just to
We
know that
really
there's
go
that much
crazy
out there.
we really go crazy in detail sometimes. You say the word
Yeah.
biology, okay, divided into, zoology and then
Right.
plant studies, and then you divide into smaller groups of, okay, I'm going to zoology, and then orders of
Sure.
coleoptera. I mean, we learn more and more about less and less
Right.
until we reach the point where we know a great deal about absolutely nothing.
Yes. Oh yeah. That's a whole other subject that I pursue on my channel. Sometimes people can go check it out. The whole issue of education and classical or liberal arts, like this idea of trying to integrate it, because we can get very segmented. But this wide swath of interdisciplinary efforts are fascinating to look into. It's almost like whatever your particular interest or expertise is, there's like something for everybody with the
Definitely.
shroud.
Oh
So
yeah,
yeah.
definitely. Well, moving on with
Here, let
with
me
the
move.
carbon
Yeah.
dating, radiometric analysis.
Yes.
Manuela and Tristan point out there were 15 protocol violations when they did that carbon dating test in 1988. And I
Yes.
think people should see this. So I'll give them a second to look at that. And as she mentioned, Philippe Boissier de Carbone, ironically named Carbone, he
Right.
published a paper.
Sure.
And, number 2 is an interesting one. They filmed them cutting the piece out, but then they took it into another room to put it in the containers before it went to the radiometric labs, kind of unusual.
Hmm.
The number 8, I think, is unusual. That there was really not a double-blind study done. You're supposed to get 3 or 4
Yeah.
different things, and you test them, not knowing which one is which. But
Right.
because the fabric of the shroud is so unique, that 3-in-1 herringbone weave,
Yes.
we could not find any controls for that. So every lab knew exactly what they had. And matter of fact, they even corresponded and knew what these other samples were from and their ages. And
Hmm.
so the controls that they gave in their lab was really just a facade in terms of trying to make it look objective. But when they held that shroud piece in their hands about the size of a
Yeah.
thumbnail and took a tinier piece off that, they knew exactly which one was the one they were looking at there.
Right.
And let's show people the next slide, which is the
Sure.
other part of those 15. Number 9,
Mm-hmm.
you're not supposed to call them up. Okay, what'd you get? We got this. What'd you get? They were
Yeah.
supposed to do this, and they were supposed to send the sealed results to the University of Padua, where they would then be collated and presented. That did not happen. All right.
Hmm.
And worse than that, number 10, that summer, it was leaked. And this was the
Yeah.
sensationalistic headlines long before the October press conference that formally said that the shroud was from the 13th century or 14th century. And so people can see here that there were definitely some irregularities that went along with this, and now they know what those
Yeah.
are. Okay.
Well, that's certainly that leak certainly creates a narrative, or well, it doesn't create it. I suppose it sort of bolsters a narrative. Um, that at least there's no small number of people out there who would be happy with that, if that makes sense, or
Yeah,
seize that opportunity to try to promote that narrative.
well, it
So,
certainly
hmm,
does. Yeah. Well, so
wow.
those are the 15 protocol violations. Now, after that, they that was in October of '88 in the
Yes.
February issue of Nature magazine. That's where they
Hmm.
published their data. And Michael Kowalski, who was the director of the British Society of the Turin Shroud, gave an excellent overview of what the numbers really look like. And without
Hmm.
confusing people, I've summarized it into 2 slides. So let's go to the
Okay.
next.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so
This Michael. I think he discussed some of this. I had him on about a year or so ago, but this would be good to kind of dig into.
right. And so I acknowledged, I asked permission from him, and he let me use these before. So I'm very thankful
Hmm.
for that. Don't get too confused by the numbers that the towns up there, those are the 3 labs, Tucson, Arizona, Oxford, and Zurich, Switzerland, where
Hmm.
it says control 1, 2, and 3. Those were other samples that they already knew the date of in terms of they've been well preserved, tested before. And that
Hmm.
control 1 so it was 927 years old. The Arizona was showing the shroud to be 646 years old. That's what those numbers are for. All right.
Hmm.
And then down at the bottom, you see the x squared value. That's the chi-square value, the Greek letter chi. And that is a very significant number because you can deviate from your expected and be acceptable. For example, if I flip a coin 100 times, could I get 53 heads and 47 tails? Yeah, that can happen. That's called
Hmm.
acceptable deviation. I'm not always going to get 50 out of 50, all right?
Hmm.
But could I get 92 heads and only 8 tails? Now, you spend the rest of
Not
your life,
likely.
you never get that. Getting 9 out of 10 would take you hours, but to get 9 out of 10 10 times in a row, that's
Yeah.
called significant deviation. And what
Okay.
happened with these weighted means is they gave it a chi-square value of 6.4. Now that where it says significance, people can get this. That's 5%. All right, there's a 5% chance you could get such a deviation between those 3 different labs because Zurich,
Hmm.
Oxford, and Arizona did not get the same ages. That is just within the realm of acceptability. If there's a 1 out of 20 chance of something happen by the laws of probability with the chi-square test, that is considered acceptable deviation. Okay,
Hmm.
anything less than 5% is considered significant deviation, and it's thrown out. That's where we draw the line. All right.
That's the absolute
Right.
the bar could not be possibly set lower for that
It's
threshold, or higher, however you want to say it.
it's pretty liberal in accepting,
Yeah.
a wide range. But what happened was the raw data was not published in Nature
Right.
magazine. And this is not the raw data. The raw data is what did the machines say, right? What were the
Mm-hmm.
numbers for each of those little samples that they did? And of course, from interviewing Tristan Casabianca and
Mm-hmm.
Emanuela, they sued Oxford by the Freedom of Information Act in 2017. He published his paper in 2019, and they looked over 700 pages of data and wrote a very solid mathematical paper showing the next slide.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the red line crosses out the errors above in black, and then what's written in red is correct. So Arizona, it should have been plus or minus 17, not 31. Oxford, it shows the error there, not much, right? And the weighted mean doesn't look like much, but look at the chi-square value.
Yeah,
It
it's a
is
little different.
8.5. And
Yeah.
significantly, that would only happen 1.43% of the time. So this shows that significant deviation, and objectively speaking, this shows the data from the radiometric analysis of the 1988 test to be invalid. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So objectively speaking,
And
it's
not, it doesn't look, and it's not even close if this is all correct. That's 1.43 is much
right.
much different than a 5. Yeah.
Yeah, you're right there. And so I'm
Hmm.
really glad that Emanuela and
Wow.
and Tristan put a lot of work into this with some statisticians, and it is so solid that they published that in 2019. And in the last 5 years, Emanuela tells on one of her programs that there has not been a single challenge to this. Two
Wow.
plus three is five. You just can't argue with that.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
and people want to know what was the result of the carbon dating. The raw data shows that it's invalid, and so in the scientific world, it's not an issue. I think
Hmm.
among the general public, this was not shared with them.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we can go to the next one. So, what caused this
Yeah, because
discrepancy? Well, on the right there,
that's the question, right? Yeah.
you see the front of Jesus, and down by the right foot there, we've enlarged that. And
Mm-hmm.
that is the area, that is the corner that the sample was taken from. Okay. Each of those little squares is about the size of a postage stamp. This the whole area to easily fit inside a 3x5 card. All right. But
Mm-hmm.
the problem is there is a significant statistical slope. And you can hit the next, just
Mm-hmm.
click the button there. We'll see the
Yeah.
arrow.
Right. Right.
As you go from the outside of the shroud to the inside of the shroud, all right, each of those samples is 91 to 97 years younger per inch. So
Hmm.
imagine if you had a piece of thread 4 inches long and one end is 300 or 400 years older than the other end. Could that be possible? No.
Yeah, it doesn't
It's,
make
so
sense.
it's not representative of the shroud. So even the data itself couldn't show these types of variations. And
Hmm.
so I don't think it will do us any good to run another carbon dating test because we don't know what caused that discrepancy. There have
That's
been
a lot of people ask that, because it seems a lot of, like myself, a lot of laymen, will just say, well, why don't they just do another test? But it sounds
yeah.
like it's more complicated than that.
Well, the problem is if you've got this variation, then you test it again, you're going to get the same thing until you understand what happened. Now there have been three possible solutions proposed. One of them by uh, Dr. Robert Rucker of Washington State, who states
Mm-hmm.
it was a neutron flux from the body that converted carbon 12 to carbon 14. Another possibility is the hypothesis by Dr. John Jackson that carbon monoxide levels are different today than they were in the past, or even near the ground, depending on how the shroud was studied. And
Mm.
a difference of just 2% in the carbon monoxide levels could affect it by 14 centuries. Another
Wow.
hypothesis is Joseph Marino, that it was a result of a reweave error and that the sample contained some 16th century material and first century material. Those are three that have been published. We don't know for certain why is there a discrepancy, but there's something else people don't know, and that is that since 1997, next slide here,
Mm-hmm.
something happened. There was a fire on the
Right.
shroud. It's not so much that the fire affected the age of the shroud, but what was done to the shroud afterwards. This happened on Good Friday, April 11th, 1997. Mario Trematore, he is the Italian firefighter pounding away at that bulletproof glass. He might have had to hit that thing over 100 times before he got the
Jeez.
first little crack. The fire is raging in the shroud in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist, which is thought to have been caused by arson.
Mm.
And after midnight, they rushed the shroud out there, as you see, and they examined it the next day to see if there was any damage from this fire. And fortunately, the shroud was not damaged. All right. And the whereabouts of the shroud were kept secret for the next year because they were concerned someone was trying to destroy the shroud, and that threat of arson or destruction is always there. But
Mm-hmm.
after they got done, they didn't put it back in that container. They actually say they modified the container from 1997 until 2002. Some scientists thought, well, there might be some insect eggs or larvae or bacteria or fungi or mildews. So they doused the inside of the shroud with thymol. Thymol has antibacterial properties,
Mm.
C10H14O. That's a
Mm.
lot of carbon. And so it has been enriched for 5 years inside that sealed container. And then in 2002, it was taken and put into a new container. But that 5 years of that thymol environment may have also affected any
Mm.
future chance of carbon dating. So I think the question you have to ask is, if you look at some of the other aspects of the shroud, the hundreds of papers written, the other evidence, is there enough evidence there to make it coherent enough without the shroud, without doing a
Sure.
carbon dating test on the shroud again?
Well, and that I'm looking at the next slide here too, because I think what a lot of people don't realize is, we've heard of carbon dating, just in general, people are aware that it's a thing, even if they don't know how it works. But I think a lot of people don't really realize that there's other ways to date things, or at least to estimate the age
Yes.
of particular,
Yes, and more
artifacts.
importantly, these three tests that you're going to show, they are not so susceptible to contamination.
Sure.
They're a little more
Sure.
free of that. They're more recent. They're not as old as carbon dating. And this is
Mm-hmm.
a graph, and don't be confused by this, folks. We're going to make it understandable for you. Across the bottom is time. I think everybody can see 1000 BC. All right. And then you can see the year 500 and see 1500 AD across the bottom. Now, these three tests were published in a book by Professor Giulio Fanti of the University of Padua in 2015 called The First Century of Christ. And the first test up there, the IR stands for infrared. It's an infrared test because when infrared radiation shines on a sample, some of it is reflected, some of it is absorbed. And what they did was they got controlled samples from many private collections and museums where the age was known of a certain object. And then they did, I say, something that was from 1500 BC, 1000 BC, 200 AD, and had a range of samples that were tested. And then they test the shroud to see where does the shroud match up with those. And that Fourier transmission infrared reflectivity, the top one shows a wide range, doesn't it? The shroud would be
Mm-hmm.
somewhere in that range. It's a big range from 700 BC to about 100 AD. That's a
Yeah.
wide range. The second one is similar, also using radiation, the Raman spectroscope.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, it's like a laser, and it does a similar thing, only lasers are different than infrared. It's got a wider range. And the third test is actually a mechanical test, and it's fascinating. And it measures the amount of strength necessary to pull those threads apart. How brittle are they? Think
Right.
of think of the sensitivity that instrument must have. And Fonte has an entire chapter describing how they designed this machine and calibrated it with other samples. And it shows that they're from about first century to maybe the 8th century, right? Now click
Mm-hmm.
the next slide. Click it once
Well,
there.
and if I may ask real quick, with well, here, I'll go to the next one, then I'll ask.
Go ahead.
Let me jump up here. Yep.
Look where those three tests overlap.
Right. Yeah.
By themselves, they're very wide. But when you consider all of them together, they give us a much more accurate picture of what the
Yeah.
likely age of the shroud is, which is what we see from the first century. And there's been a fourth test since that time called the wide angle X-ray scatter, the Wax's
Yes,
test.
that one is the one that I really want to understand more. Well, I want to understand them all more, but yeah, that one's been getting a lot of
Yeah.
coverage in the last couple of years.
Well, it's radiation, so it's similar to the first two in a way, and that you
Yeah.
measure how much is absorbed, how much is reflected. That's kind of a simple way of putting it.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, the experts that do that will get into much more detail, but in any event, samples can be compared to known samples to check the reliability of that age, perhaps. So those four modern day tests put the shroud in the first century. So what would we have to gain by doing another carbon dating test if the shroud is contaminated from that thymol that it soaked in 5 years? It wasn't
Sure.
soaking wet, but the inside was laden with it.
Right. Yeah. And is and yeah, and that's there's so many fascinating things to consider with this, because people might point at the tensile strength test here and say, well, why is this one so different? I mean, I suppose, could it just be that you know the tensile strength of the fabric itself is perhaps stronger than
It was
than
well
other cloths, or
it
just
was
well
well cared
preserved?
for. Yeah,
Right.
Mike,
That's
it was
yeah,
well cared for. It was very
yeah,
well cared for, and that's why you see, 100 to 800. As linen
yeah.
goes, linen is much more durable than cotton, but
Hmm.
with the cloths that we find from mummies that are 2,000 or 3,000 years old, they're not as well preserved as this was. This linen has a fairly good durability. I wouldn't point it out as being miraculous. I would point it out as
Hmm.
being remarkably well preserved, but it was very
Yeah.
well cared for.
Well, and this may not the best analogy, but I think of things like we in our neighborhood here, and it's I think it's common more and more. But it seems like, at least at least in the United States, it seems like a lot more people's garages are not for their cars anymore, but for all the stuff that we don't know where else to put it, and then you park out in the driveway or on the street. And it's fascinating to me that over the years, in my family's experience, at least just anecdotally, cars that you actually keep in the garage last longer than cars that are exposed to all the elements outside all the time, and all the heat and the cold and everything. So to me, that might be a silly analogy, but just from the straightforward reality that for so many people, again, if this is authentic, for so many people for 2,000 years almost, this thing has been protected, from conquest, protected from the elements. It's survived a lot along the way. It wouldn't surprise me at all that could be a factor.
No, I think you're right. I think you're right on with that one. So,
Well, shall I move on here to
yeah,
the
let's
next
go to the
one?
next
Yeah,
one
yeah,
here.
sure. Okay, so what do we have here?
Okay, so what we're looking at is the shroud before 2002 on the left and after 2002. And these handful of Europeans got to the Archbishop and did this very covertly. They basically convinced him that we need to intervene, or the shroud is going to age in a way because there's contamination on it. We need to get that off. And so what they did was they took off the patches. You can see those 8 larger patches on the left side, those 8 triangles. Those patches were removed, and then the
Oh, I see.
backing was removed. If you look down the bottom left-hand corner, that backing was the same size as the shroud. It was 8 cubits by 2 cubits. That's what the
Hmm.
Poor Clare nuns laid the shroud on when they put the patches on, and they did that in
I see.
1534. So they take off the old patches, put it on a new backing, which was owned, by the way, from Mitra Fleury Lemberg. It's a 20th century cloth.
Oh, yeah.
And then they sewed it, they vacuumed it. They vacuumed it. Do you see how much lighter it is on the
Yes.
right? It was vacuumed, and then they sewed it back in. So those triangles you see on the right are not patches, those are holes.
Hmm.
Those are holes, and they sewed it with a very specific type of nylon thread. So you're looking at shroud, hole, shroud there. And then
Hmm.
after the fact, word came out they'd done this. And this was very controversial in the scientific world because there was no broad consultation undertaken to decide whether or not this step was necessary. Did they need to intervene? There were 2 schools of thought. Some people think that you need to do, never show it, keep it hidden. And other
Hmm.
people say, well, if it's authentic, it'll stand on its own. Because if you look at the Tilma of Guadalupe, it
Hmm.
stands on its own, without trying to change things. But it is what it is. And so in doing that, when they vacuumed it, not only destroyed a lot of the archaeological evidence of pollen grains, travertine aragonite soil and such, but it stretched the fibers out. So on the next slide, people can see it is stretched. You can go back and forth a couple of times if you like there. All right.
Oh,
And
wow.
that vacuuming caused it to get longer. So sometimes people will see 2
Huh.
different lengths for the shroud. The left is the way it's always been, 14 feet 3 inches long. On the right is what it was after 2002 restoration. It's 14 feet 6 inches long. So it got 3
Wow.
inches longer. And then width-wise, it was 3 feet 7. And now on the right, it's 3 feet 9. And
Hmm.
because of that length, sometimes people will say, oh, it shows that Jesus was 6 foot. Well, the shroud, as it was studied by the Stirp team in 1978, showed him to be about 5 feet 10. Okay.
Yeah,
But
that's what I've heard. Yeah.
but on the right, it shows him, to be, 6 feet tall. So the problem there is that the length of the shroud has changed because they did an intervention. All right.
Hmm.
Yeah.
What year was that again, Jim? It was what was?
That
Was
was
that
called
like
the restoration project of 2002. Led
oh,
by,
right. Okay. So
led by
after what began with the restoration following that fire in 1997. A
wow,
couple years
yeah, it
after
was,
that.
5 years after the fire. But if you look down
Yeah.
the bottom left-hand corner, that's a picture Barry Schwartz gave me. Barry Schwartz, friend of mine, he allowed me to use these
Hmm.
pictures. In 1978, they had not taken the carbon dating sample yet. Now look
Right.
at the bottom left-hand corner of the new one.
Yeah.
That picture was taken in 2002, and that piece is gone because it was cut out in 1988 for the carbon and radiocarbon analysis.
Wow. Hmm.
You see the
That's
difference there.
something. Yeah.
So, and so what you can go with the next one. You're
Yep.
right on
Sure.
with that.
I bumped
What
my.
I tell people to remember is that the STIRP team only had 3 Catholics. There were 33 scientists involved. 26 of them were on site with the shroud. The other 7 were support scientists later. But these 33 scientists took all that data from the 1978 STIRP study, in which they worked around the clock for 120 consecutive hours. They were all experts in their field. And after 3 years of publishing in 20 professional scientific peer-reviewed journals, they published the next 3 things. The question they were trying to answer was how the image was formed. That was the whole purpose of it. Not
Right.
they weren't trying to prove the resurrection. They're trying to prove how was the image formed. They could not answer that question, all right? But they did come up with these 3 facts. The first fact you can show there, okay, analyzing this, there's no paints, pigments, or dyes. It is not a painting. The superficiality of it is so fine that we can't even replicate that today. It's 0.2 of 1 micron. And to give people
Wow.
an idea of just how thin that is, you all know what a millimeter is, about the width of a paperclip, right? There's
Hmm.
1,000 microns in 1 millimeter. The yellowed area of the outermost fibrils is only 0.2 of 1 micron. So we're talking 1/5 of 1/1000th of 1 millimeter. That trait of superficiality goes into the second point you're going to show here.
Wow.
It is not the work of an artist. We know of no material. If you touch any type of pigment to a thread, it's going to soak through by capillary action, goes all
Yeah.
the way through the thread. One of these little threads, by the way, is only a
That's what I
third.
was just gonna say. It's the example I give my students a lot when I share this. I'll say to them, "How many of you guys have when you decorate a T-shirt or something, or use a Sharpie, like any kind of marker you use on a cotton T-shirt, it immediately bleeds through, and now you're talking about a much thinner cloth and such unbelievably consistent superficial level.
Yes.
It blows my mind.
And this thread of the shroud is actually made up of 70 to 120 microfibrils. And it
Right.
doesn't even penetrate to the center of one of those microfibrils that make it up.
Wow.
You see, it was hand spun. So when you look at that thread, you think it's one thing. And on the shroud, it's over 100 tiny things, much tinier than a human hair. And so for that reason, the 3-dimensionality of it, and there's lots of reasons I won't have time to go over, but it's not the work of an artist. Okay. Then
Right.
thirdly, okay, we can account for the blood. The blood soaked onto the shroud by direct contact. That came from a body. And the fact that the plasma was separated from the solid part shows that that person was truly dead. Okay.
Right.
So that we can explain, but the totality of that image with the superficiality, with the 3D nature, with the missing side images, all of that, that gives evidence that we just can't. There's no natural process. They've actually done experiments where they tried to bury a pig in a blanket and then dig it up later. You just don't get the clarity. You get wraparound distortions and all kinds of things. So
Hmm.
what I tell people is, here's something that is over 40 years old, and this is good science. This has withstood the test of time and intense scientific scrutiny. All right. So I think people shouldn't get caught up in the minor objections. Just share these facts, and these facts will speak for themselves.
Sure.
And when people realize this, they sometimes say, "Well, gosh, it's no longer a question is it authentic, but how could it not be authentic?"
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Well, and then thinking of like you mentioned before, the vacuuming, removing certain uh, geological footprints. But then I see your next slide here. Looking back at the original data, did you want to point out some of what they did find
Yeah.
originally with that?
Is this the one with the travertine argent? Sure. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So these are the steps of the Jerusalem temple that Christ saw in his lifetime, both as a
Hmm.
12-year-old boy and as a man in his 30s. And the temple was destroyed in 73 AD, but these steps remain there today. They're the famous South Steps. And what's unique
Sure.
about this type of limestone is that it's unique to Jerusalem. If you want to hit the next one there,
Mm-hmm.
very unique, and again, called travertine aragonite. One more time.
Mm-hmm.
And that
Oh,
travertine
there it is.
aragonite is unique to just this Jerusalem area. And so we find this travertine aragonite on the shroud in 3 places: on the soles of the feet, on the knees, all right, and on the
Mm-hmm.
nose. 3
Right
parts of
below
our
there.
Lord's body. Back up,
Oh, sure. Sorry, I got
back
buried
up.
there with the with the face. Yes, yeah.
Yeah, 3 parts of our Lord's body that would have touched the ground on Good Friday still show
Right.
up on the shroud. All right.
Wow.
And if that isn't enough, I came to an understanding. I've been studying this pretty intensely the last 12 years. And I was speaking with Father Mitch Pacwa on this.
Mm-hmm.
He said what was really convincing to him some years ago, he read about this atheistic scientist, and she was kind of an expert in these types of archaeology things. And this limestone is often found with another element. And that
Hmm.
element is called strontium. And by looking at the limestone strontium combination, you can trace where it came from. For example, gold is often found with mercury. You have to separate
Okay.
the two, but it's unique for each place. So the gold mercury content on the spectrograph here might be different from someplace 5 miles away.
Interesting.
Okay?
Okay.
And
That precise.
when this atheistic scientist, when she did her research on the limestone strontium content of the slab from the edicule, Christ's tomb in the
Mm-hmm.
Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem,
Yep.
that limestone strontium spectrograph peak was matched to the limestone
Wow.
strontium found on the shroud, and it was a perfect match. And
Wow.
what this tells us is the shroud was once in that tomb.
That's
And
outstanding.
that doesn't prove the resurrection, but it gives compelling evidence that this was the burial cloth of Christ, certainly.
Right. Right. Well, and then the whole other topic, right, with the matching of the all the wound and blood flow matchings between the face and facial back of the head areas on the shroud and the sudarium, which we know these two cloths have not been together,
Right.
anytime in recent memory. So yeah, that's just all these fascinating matches.
So one of the points I like to make with people is that if we can accept, say, the authenticity of the bones of King Tut, you know, I
Mm-hmm.
assume that they know what they're doing when they found him. That okay, those are the bones of King Tut based on a certain amount of information, and it seems reasonable. I
Mm-hmm.
don't contest that; those are probably the bones of King Tut. But how could one reject the authenticity of the shroud, which has a nearly infinite amount of knowledge beyond that is coherent? And so it seemed to me sort of hypocritical to accept that, yeah, that's King Tut, but this can't be the shroud when the
Right.
evidence is so overwhelming compared to underwhelming when you compare those two.
Yeah.
So that's something that I think a person has to consider. Am I being reasonable about this? That we don't have to believe in the resurrection because of the shroud. Look at all the great saints that spent their lifetime never heard of
Right.
the shroud. The resurrection stands on its own. But if God has given us the shroud for this time period, what should our response be? Should it be one of indifference, or can we use it to strengthen our faith, not replace our faith, but to
Right.
strengthen it?
Well, and I'm glad you said that because there's a lot of I get all kinds of comments on these videos. Most of them are pretty positive, but once in a while, someone will chime in and I take them at their words, very sincere concern on their part that I don't need the shroud for my faith in Jesus. Now, and I want to be clear, neither
Yeah,
do I, and I've never even remotely willingly suggested that.
I agree.
Um,
I agree.
but by the same token, I think they miss what I think is an opportunity, right? And that's how I look at it. Is this an opportunity that God is giving us, to enhance or to augment or to go deeper into our appreciation of our faith? And why miss that opportunity if it's
Exactly.
something He's offering you? So that's just something
That's
to
an excellent
consider.
point. I agree wholeheartedly with you, Mike.
Yeah, yeah. So, um, I
So
now
I
do
do
you want
think that
to?
the shroud
Oh, go ahead.
is a message of. I think it's a message of hope. It's a message
Yes.
of hope because people look at that body on the shroud, and they believe, okay, Jesus was resurrected, and that's going to happen to me too.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to be resurrected at the end of time, and that, of course, that
Right.
takes faith. But I think, and I was once giving this talk to women at a women's prison, the Nebraska Correctional Center for Women here in Nebraska. It's in York,
Mm-hmm.
Nebraska. And I gave this shroud presentation to about 35 prison inmates there. At the start of the talk, they were kind of disinterested, looking around, and then all of a sudden it started to click with them. And usually people wait till the end of the talk till they ask questions. These gals were just jumping up right away, asking questions right and left. It was a wonderful exchange, and by the
Wow.
end of it, they were beaming with hope. And I just
Yeah.
saw that in a very real way, that the shroud is a message of hope.
Yeah, absolutely. That's I forget where the quote comes from, but I use it in my eschatology class a lot. That mankind is uniquely called to survive death. What an amazing way to think about it, right? That it's not to avoid it. We will face the grave, but this in your face reality that we don't just believe in death and then some sort of amorphous existence up in the ether or whatever. No, like I this body, no matter what happens to it, will eventually be, reconstituted and glorified and united with my soul, right? That I will, everything about death will be in the past for me at some time.
We can go through the last couple slides here just to touch
Sure,
upon
yeah,
a couple
absolutely.
other items, if you'd like.
Yeah, yeah,
My friend, that's very short. So he passed away last month, as many of your viewers
yes.
might know. He was a skeptic on the shroud from 1978 to 1995. So he was a shroud skeptic for 17 years until his last objection was answered. And then because he saw so much misinformation out on the internet, he started this website, shroud.com.
Mm.
And
I've got it
although
linked below. I always love to link it every time in these videos. Yeah.
Yeah. Although Barry believes that the shroud is the burial cloth of Jesus, but he doesn't believe that Jesus is God, right? Doesn't believe in the resurrection. But in the last few months of his life, he had a kind of a very serious, intense illness, and lots of people were praying that he had time to meditate on, who is Jesus, and perhaps that decision was changed. The last I spoke with him, uh, he believed that certainly the shroud is authentic, but he just didn't believe in the resurrection. There might be some other
Sure.
people that type of thinking as well. But next
Yeah.
slide.
Yep.
If people want to contact me for whatever, for give them a presentation to their conference or their group or whatever, they can get that there. There's the
Mm-hmm.
email for them, and we can go to the next one now.
Sure.
Oh, phone numbers too. Yeah.
And I'll have that below too, also for them in case they missed it.
Okay. People ask, where's the shroud now? It is inside this aluminum reliquary. This is the aluminum reliquary it was put into back in 2002, and they took all the air out of it. Oxygen is very reactive, and it's been replaced with argon. Remember from high school chemistry, argon
Mm-hmm.
is a gas, doesn't react with anything, and controlled temperature and humidity under 24-hour armed guard, under very elaborate security. And then there's a drape over it. And we see the next slide.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is that aluminum reliquary in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. As you walk up to the main altar, to your left is this side chapel. And down the middle, people can see the big black line there. Those are two extremely very heavy, bullet-resistant, thick glass panes that are protecting
Mm.
it. So that's where it's at as we speak.
And then they
But
have the holy face image up for people just in their meditation there.
yeah, you could come close to
Okay.
pray.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then there's some other open questions about the shroud that I'll just very
Mm-hmm.
briefly address here with the next slide.
Yeah, sure.
How did we know its history shows it to be in Constantinople? When did it get there? There's two schools of thought. The one that's been around for decades is the work of Ian Wilson, who believes it went through Edessa and then arrived in Constantinople in 944. More recently, there's some compelling evidence that the shroud had gone through Antioch and had reached Constantinople as early as 574. So I don't state either one of those as a fact or taking sides with one, but that's an open question. And so if
Sure.
people want to raise doubts about that route, that's something that could be debated, but it certainly doesn't, I don't think, affects the authenticity of the shroud, nor does the missing years from 1204 to 1355. We don't know where it was from the sack of Constantinople to its display in 1355
Right.
by Geoffrey de Charnay. All right, so that's another open question. The carbon-14 problems, the fact that it's been declared invalid is a fact, but what caused the carbon-14 results to show what they did? Why was there this discrepancy? And I gave three possibilities, so that's an
Mm-hmm.
open question. What formed the mechanism? Robert Rucker's talking about neutrons.
Mm-hmm.
Professor Giulio Fanti believes it was a coronal discharge of electrons. Dr. John Jackson has spoken of ultraviolet light. That's a
Hmm.
possibility. So radiation is the only serious area of consideration to try and answer that question today. How was the image formed? They're looking at
Yeah.
radiation. All the artist theories have been shown to not hold up by looking at the 17 traits of the shroud.
Sure.
Where was the nail in the hands? Okay, we know the exit wound. Okay,
Hmm.
we know the exit wound.
Right.
Two different doctors. um, Professor Pierre Barbet puts it in the wrist here,
Hmm.
and Frederick Zagaby puts it a little bit more up in the hand there. They're about 2 inches apart. We
Yeah.
don't know the entrance point. Does it really matter? Okay. People say, well, I've seen Padre Pio, and Padre Pio has the exit wound in the middle of his
Hmm.
hand, and the shroud shows it down here. And that's a good question. I asked that to a priest, and I got an answer from him. He said, when stigmatists are allowed to share in Christ's passion, Christ isn't trying to give us an anatomy lesson. Um,
Right.
doesn't matter where it's at. And more importantly, Padre Pio had to answer that question. And they said, "Why is your wound up here?" He said, "Do you think if I had the exact same pain that our Lord had, that I could survive?"
Well, that's a good. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's a super. In that case, it's a supernatural
yeah,
manifestation, right? With tremendous theological implications. It's not the direct, physical, consequence of a Roman execution. So yeah, that
exactly.
makes sense.
Yeah, well said, Mike. And then, of course, the was it one nail or two nails in the feet? It appears to be one nail. People, I've seen a paper presented trying to show two nails. That could be
Hmm.
considered an open question. But these open questions are the details about the shroud, and they really don't do anything to challenge its authenticity. All right,
Sure.
so it's not surprising to me that we don't hear anything written about the shroud for several centuries. I mean, you don't see a word about it in the Acts of the Apostles, nor do you see anything written about the Blessed Virgin Mary.
Right.
It's believed that she spent her final years in Ephesus, all
Hmm.
right, in that house. That was well, very well researched, and the Anne Catherine Newman, Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich,
Right. Yeah.
describes how they found it, and I think there's very solid evidence that she spent her time in Ephesus. But
Yeah.
if you tell where holy
I've
things,
been in that. I've been in that house. It's
oh
a
my
great
gosh,
blessing.
Mike,
Yeah.
that
Yep.
would be a topic for a future program of yours. I've always been
Yeah.
fascinated. I've read books on it.
Oh, that
Maybe
would
we
be
have
great.
the
Yeah,
same book.
this I bought this paperweight there actually. I have over here. But yeah, that was a wonderful experience, and that would be yeah, I'd love to. So wait, have you've covered that like with Anne Catherine Emmerich's visions and the discovery at all, or
No, no, but I've read a lot about it, and I think there's very
yeah,
compelling evidence based on how Anne Catherine Emmerich directed them to that site back in
yeah,
just
that's
before the
wild.
20th century was very compelling, and
Yes,
seems very
yeah,
the fact that there's a spot in Jerusalem that says, this is where the Dormition took place. Um, Mary was probably also in Jerusalem, but what did they go back to Jerusalem for? Probably the first council of Jerusalem,
sure,
because James had
yeah,
been killed. All the apostles and the Virgin Mary, because John is taking care of her, they go back to Jerusalem.
right.
It's possible she lived in Ephesus, and then the Dormition took place in Jerusalem. So there's no contradiction there.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, there's Jim. There's so much more to talk about. I'd love to have you back on at some point. We could go into more detail on any particular aspect. But yeah, I just really want to thank you again at this. We on this channel, as people know, we've explored all kinds of different specific aspects of the shroud. But it's I think very helpful for people to be able to see this a little bit more in depth and to try to get a sense of the broad undertaking and enterprise that understanding the research really is. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and I'm glad you got that point. That I was working on people's understanding. It's one thing to hear something, repeat that sentence, but it's another thing to really understand it. And oh, that's why, and what that's the
Yeah.
numbers, and that. So I hope that people have a more well-grounded understanding of these aspects of the shroud. And there are many others, of course, but the one slide that showed the three facts that there's no paints, pigments, or dyes. This is not the work of an artist. What's left. And
Yeah.
like you said, the open invitation to this opportunity, I believe we should take advantage of that opportunity. So thank you, Mike, for having me on.
Wonderful.
I'd be glad to be on again sometime.
Well, thanks so much again, Jim. God bless you.
Thank you.
What a fascinating and insightful time. And I always enjoy, as you all know, getting to have these opportunities to explore all that there is to explore with these questions of our faith, really, ultimately. But, questions that are not I think, hindered by the shroud, as some people sometimes suggest. Some people concerned that this is some form of idolatry or whatever the case may be. But like I said in the interview with Jim, I see this as a tremendous opportunity to consider more deeply, to consider more authentically where I'm at with questions about our Lord's incarnation, his suffering, his death, his resurrection. Do I really believe that? What are the challenges to that faith in me? Where might I be tempted because of my own current struggles, my own sufferings, to doubt, tempted to think that this situation I'm facing, this challenge I might be facing right now, is really the end, and there's no hope beyond it. But as Jim pointed out, hope is really what this is all about, and we get this tremendously exciting, never-ending opportunity to see what else the Shroud has for us to consider as this mystery unfolds. So thank you so much for stopping by the Gracious Guest Show. Please subscribe, like this video, share it far and wide if you haven't already. And in the future, make sure you keep coming back and seeing what else we've got here, because there's a lot of great content and a lot more to come. So God bless you, and until next time, don't forget to wonder. Take care.